actually all four, has some semblance of it. Three of them detail what happens while Christ is on the cross. You know, as we often do in around Easter time, we share with what we call the 7 last sayings of Christ. And in some ministries that have Good Friday services, you'll see them go through the week, which is called Passion Week, which leads up to Easter Sunday morning, detailing the events that transpired the week before Christ is crucified. So it's very familiar in that we know it, and some of us may even know it by heart. 3 of the gospel writers give us this story concerning the 2 young men that were on the crosses on either side of Jesus. Luke, however, gives us specific detail, and the specific detail is what I wanted to talk about this morning. Read here again with me. There were also 2 others, malefactors. The word malefactor simply means lawbreaker. It simply means that young men or people who actually did something that was against current law. And you will note, as I would, they were criminals. You will note, as I would, that this time, in this period, Roman law was what was in place at the time. Roman law, because the Roman government, the Roman king, Caesar, was in charge and had made the province of Judea part of the Roman Empire. And so the culture throughout the entire region had been assimilated into what would be at that time the entirety of the world, but had been assimilated into Roman culture. Therefore, the law was not a Judeo or a Christian law, but it was Roman law. And so the criminals that were chosen at this time to be crucified, they were chosen to be crucified because they broke Roman law. And you also know that they were crucified. It was not uncommon to be crucified in this time, crucifixion being hung up on a cross, in a place of visibility so that others can see. It was really more about the embarrassing factor rather than about the death. It was to show that you were a lawbreaker and that everyone would see the injustice. They may not have known that the crime that you performed, but they would have known that you were a disgrace. It was embarrassing to be hung on the cross. It was embarrassing in the sense that it was exposure to law-abiding citizens and a signal to other criminals, this is what's going to happen to you if you break the law. It was cruel. Cruel by nature. Meant so. Designed to be so. Possibly crueler than a swift execution of beheading. Because, God bless you, crueler because in the way that it was done, death was not instantaneous. Death would be over a process of time. If you were going to die on the cross, it was going to be an excruciating death. It was going to be one that you knew you paying for something. Sometimes it's easier, if you're going to die instantaneous. I remember at the death of my mother, when she passed away, I was at work that morning, and I worked in Washington, D.C., and my mom's home was like 12 blocks away. I used to go home for lunch or go to her house rather for lunch and eat lunch there. And that morning, after I got to work, I got a call from somebody that said, "Come quick, your mother, something is wrong with her." And that morning, I just happened to drive that morning and parked in the garage. I jumped in my car, and I probably didn't even alert my supervisor except for something like, "I gotta go." And drove over to where my mother's house was. And when I got there, the door was open and everybody was gone. And the person who had called me had told me that they had already taken her to the hospital. When I got to the hospital, Howard University Hospital, I'll never forget this day. When I got there, I was the first one there from my family. And when I showed up at the emergency room, which is where they had taken her, I walked into the emergency room, and there lay her body. Tubes sticking out of her mouth, and a blanket sheet over her head. And she had already gone. She was already gone. So her death was swift and almost instantaneous. Didn't have to worry about quality of life after she had been stricken with the illness, but she was gone in an instant. For the moment, and for a period after that, I would sadly rehearse that event in my memory, in my life, because it was very tragic for me. And we talked about questioning God this morning, so I questioned God, and I wondered in my heart, and I know I didn't go and charge God foolishly, but I did question. I wondered in my heart, God, why did I not have a chance to say goodbye to my mother? Why did you take her so quickly? I didn't understand why I could not have time to at least spend with her to say, "Mom, you know, I wish you could stay around." You know, some things that I would have said in my heart. So I didn't get a chance to do that. It wasn't until years later that something tragic happened in my wife's life. And I'm not going to tell her testimony, but in a nutshell, we lost her father and we lost her mother all in the same year. Now, her mother had been stricken ill. And when she got ill, it was a process. Anybody who knows or who has had this experience, you know that this is life-altering. When her mother was stricken with the illness, her life slowly and deliberately became less and less the life that we knew it to be. She became bedridden. And then over the process of the few months, the doctor had given her 1 month. But over the process of time, I think it took about 6 months. And in that time, family members, my wife in general, would have to go back home and spend time with her to make sure that she was comfortable as she was slowly slipping away. And I mean slowly slipping away. I watched them change her bed sheets because she became incontinent. I watched them feed her because she couldn't do it of her own accord. I watched them, and this was something that I'll never forget either. I watched them have to, change her positioning in the bed because she had laid so long in one position that bed sores would become part of her, and she was suffering. And so they would have to shift her body constantly from her back to her side to her stomach, and carefully watching as she slips on into judgment. It was then that I realized that God does all things well. I realized then that God knows what he is doing. He knows what you can handle. He knows what you can't handle. And I rationalized. You may not have done this, but I did. I said, Lord, thank you. Because I would not have been able to take seeing my mother go through something like that. However, I watched as my wife and her sisters, now the boys were different. She had 4 sisters, I think. I watched them as they take out of their time to go and care for their mother. And in my, you may say in my ignorance or in my, stupidity, I said, Lord, thank you. Because there was something that he knows about us that we ourselves never even know. And you'll never find out some things about you until you go through certain situations. And that's why we ought to take the time, even when things aren't going the way that we want them to. I know this is not popular. We don't hear this in churches a lot. But we ought to take the time to tell God, thank you, even when bad things happen to us. Because you never know how bad it could be. You never know if it weren't happening at this time, whether or not you would be able to handle it, but God allowed it to happen at that time because he knew that it can happen right now this way because you were able to take it. And whatever you're going through, don't ever get to the point where you criticize. You can question, but don't ever get to the point where Satan makes you criticize God for doing what God does when God does it. Amen? Amen. This day, they lead him to the cross. Three holes inlaid in the ground, up on top of a hill, specifically designed for a cross. Actually, 3 of them. And this particular day, someone decides that on the day that Christ is crucified, 2 criminals would be crucified with him. Verse 33 says, and when they were come to the place which is called Calvary, there they crucified him and the malefactors, one on the right hand and the other on the left. And so you got this picture in your mind. And every now and then you can drive through, you can probably drive down 95, somewhere between King's Dominion and Fredericksburg, and look out over to your right-hand side coming northbound. And you may see 3 crosses standing there. And for years, before I came into God, I wondered, what mean those 3 crosses? Why do they have 3 crosses sitting out there on the horizon? And I've seen them laid out at churches. And I've wondered, why do they have 3 crosses there? In the center stands this one that seems like